Why was the medic the calmest person in the corridor, even though she was the one bleeding? The concrete floor beneath Tessa Harmon was so cold it felt almost alive, not the casual chill of a basement or the quiet coolness of a hospital hallway. This was the cold of a place that had been buried under a mountain for decades, a cold that belonged to concrete poured by men who were long gone and forgotten. She could feel it through her uniform, through the thin layer of fabric between her skin and the floor. It crawled slowly into her bones. But the cold wasn't the problem. The blood was. Her left hand pressed hard against the gash across her right shoulder. The wound had opened minutes earlier when a ruptured pipe exploded above them during a breach. Metal fragments had torn through the corridor like angry birds of steel. One of them had found her. She had already assessed the damage. Not arterial. Heavy bleeding, but survivable. 40 minutes before blood loss became a serious factor. Tessa filed that information away the way a mechanic acknowledges a warning light on a dashboard. Something to monitor, not something to panic about. Her right hand held the radio. "Dalton," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, not forced calmness, not someone trying to hide fear. Just steady. Kowalski needs to shift left, 12 feet to the alcove before the next patrol passes. Boots moved somewhere in the darkness. 8 seconds, she added. 40 feet away, shadows shifted as one of the seals slid into position. Tessa watched the corridor like a chess player watching a board. She knew where everyone was. Every doorway, every angle, every patrol route. She had memorized the layout of the facility hours earlier, not because someone told her to, but because surviving inside a place like this required it. The hallway smelled like rust and diesel. Old Soviet concrete had a particular smell too, something chemical and metallic that lingered in the air like history refusing to leave. Bootsteps echoed 2 floors above them. Then someone crouched beside her. Garrett Sloan, the team's assigned medic. He dropped to one knee, penlight clenched between his teeth, med kit already open. He worked quickly, efficient and precise. But every few seconds his eyes flicked toward her face. Because something about the way she was behaving didn't make sense. Most wounded soldiers became quieter. Or louder. They grimaced, they cursed, they breathed harder. Tessa Harmon simply kept directing the team. As if lying on a cold floor bleeding through her sleeve was just another line item on a checklist. Sloan finished sealing the wound and pulled out his small field notebook. Standard procedure. Even down here. Even in a black operation, buried under a mountain in the Republic of Georgia. Name, he said quietly. Tessa Harmon. He wrote. Rank. Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class. His pen moved automatically to the next line. Call sign. For 2 seconds she said nothing. Just long enough for the silence to stretch slightly in the corridor. Then she spoke. Ghost Actual. Sloan's pen stopped. At the far end of the hallway, Rex Dalton froze. Not gradually. Not like someone pausing to think. He simply stopped moving. His shoulders lifted a fraction of an inch and stayed there. Kowalski looked from Dalton, back toward the woman on the floor. Something passed across his face. Not recognition. Not confusion. Something older than both. And suddenly the corridor felt smaller. Because those 2 words carried a weight none of them were prepared for. But to understand why, you have to go back 72 hours. Why was the medic studying the terrain like a sniper? Tbilisi at 3 in the morning felt like a city caught between centuries. Ancient churches stood beside gray Soviet apartment blocks. The river cut quietly through the center of it all like it had for hundreds of years, indifferent to everything happening along its banks. Colonel Alan Marsh waited in the dim hotel lobby. He was 57 years old, silver-haired, composed. The kind of man who spoke carefully, because he knew exactly which details he wanted people to hear. Tessa Harmon arrived carrying one small duffel bag. No hesitation. No small talk. Marsh explained the mission. A Ukrainian scientist named Volkov had been kidnapped from a conference 11 days earlier. Intelligence suggested he was being held inside a former Soviet mining facility in the Caucasus Mountains. A SEAL team was already in country. Their primary medic had been pulled unexpectedly. They needed a replacement. Mission window, 48 hours. Tessa listened quietly. She asked exactly one question. What's on the third level? Marsh paused. Only briefly. There are 2 confirmed sublevels, he replied, B1 and B2. She watched him. Not suspicious. Just measuring. Understood, she said. But the word unconfirmed stayed with her. Because Tessa Harmon had spent 7 years chasing a different question entirely. And sometimes the answers lived in places people claimed didn't exist. Later that morning, she entered the safe house where the SEAL team was preparing. Maps covered the walls. Satellite images were pinned to boards. Equipment cases sat open across folding tables. Rex Dalton turned when she stepped inside. 58 years old. Broad shoulders. Pale blue eyes that had seen enough combat to stop reacting to it. Harmon, he said. You're the corpsman. Yes, sir. He nodded once. Across the room, Kowalski leaned against the wall, arms crossed. No offense, he said. The tone suggested plenty of offense. But I requested an operator, not someone organizing bandages. Tessa set her bag down. No offense taken. That was all she said. But Fletcher Holt noticed something. She wasn't studying casualty evacuation routes on the map. She was studying firing angles, entry points, terrain lines, the way a sniper reads a battlefield. He said nothing, but he filed the observation away. Later that night, they flew low through the Caucasus Mountains in an MH-6 Little Bird. The world through night vision goggles glowed green and flat. Tessa leaned toward Holt. There's a dead zone on the north approach, she whispered. He looked at her. Satellite shows a uniform slope, she continued, but the runoff patterns suggest a shelf about 200 meters out. Holt glanced back at the terrain. 10 minutes later, he quietly mentioned the shelf to Dalton. The helicopter adjusted course 15 degrees. Nobody asked how the medic had seen it first. Some mysteries reveal themselves slowly. Others wait for the worst moment possible. When did the pain begin, and why didn't she tell anyone? The landing zone was nothing but rock and frozen grass. The helicopter barely touched the ground before lifting away again. The mountain swallowed the sound within seconds. They moved immediately. Dalton forward. Holt beside him. Kowalski and Weld behind. Sloan. Then Tessa at the rear. Exactly where they had placed her. Exactly where someone they didn't yet trust belonged. She stepped between 2 rocks. The stone beneath her right boot shifted. Her ankle twisted. There was a sharp internal snap, not pain yet. Just the announcement of pain. Her weight transferred wrong. For a split second, her body tried to collapse. She shifted her balance. Stepped forward. Kept walking. No one turned around. No one noticed. And Tessa said nothing. Because missions didn't pause for injuries. Inside the facility, the air smelled ancient. Rust. Metal. Diesel. And the strange chemical scent of old Soviet concrete. They cleared the first level quickly. Then the explosion happened. A pressure charge somewhere above them sent shockwaves through the pipes running along the ceiling. One pipe ruptured. Metal fragments tore through the hallway. Travis Weld went down. Sloan reached him first. Breathing was wrong. Shallow. Desperate. Tessa was beside him instantly. Tension pneumothorax, she said calmly. Sloan checked. She was right. 60 seconds, she added. Kowalski looked back. We're taking fire. We don't have 60 seconds. Tessa didn't raise her voice. Then it becomes a different problem. Dalton looked at Sloan. Do it. The needle punctured Weld's chest. Air hissed out. His breathing changed immediately. The clock stopped. They moved on. Later, a hostile guard rounded a corner unexpectedly. 12 feet away. Too close for a suppressed shot. Too loud. Too risky. Tessa moved first. 3 seconds. The man was on the ground. Unconscious. Alive. Silent. The SEAL stared at her. Because medics didn't usually move like that. But nobody asked questions. Not yet. Some answers come later. Usually when it's already too late to pretend they don't matter. Why did the sniper shot feel familiar? They found Volkov on the second level. Exhausted. Hungry. But alive. When he saw Tessa, his expression changed. They were waiting, he said quietly. Waiting for her. The words hung in the air. No one spoke. Then Holt spotted the sniper. A thermal signature on the ridge overlooking the extraction zone. 800 meters away. Wind 11 miles per hour. The team's sniper tried to settle behind the rifle. His injured arm trembled. He looked at Dalton. Dalton looked at Tessa. Can you shoot? Yes. She didn't hesitate. The Barrett .50 caliber rifle weighed 30 pounds. Not a weapon you handled casually. Tessa settled behind it like someone returning to a familiar chair. She breathed out slowly. The mountain wind pushed against the rifle. She adjusted, waited for the stillness between heartbeats, and squeezed. The rifle roared. On the ridge, the thermal signature stopped moving. Kowalski stared. Because that shot wasn't luck. That shot was a career. But the questions weren't finished yet. Not even close. What kind of medic walks 9 hours on a broken leg? Sloan noticed first. Blood had soaked through the fabric near Tessa's lower leg. He crouched, ran careful fingers along the bone, then looked up slowly. You've been walking on this since the landing zone. 6 hours ago. She said nothing. Stress fracture, Sloan whispered. Maybe worse. Dalton stepped closer. Can you continue? Yes. I need more than yes. I'll tell you when I can't. He studied her face, then nodded. Sloan splinted the leg. It wasn't a fix, just a compromise. When he finished, he opened his notebook again. Casualty log. Call signs. Routine documentation. He reached Tessa. Call sign. 2 seconds passed. Then she said it again. Ghost actual. This time Dalton turned slowly. Who assigned you that? No one, she said. I chose it. Why? She met his eyes. Because it was my father's. The silence in the corridor became heavy. Ryan Harmon, she continued quietly. Lieutenant Commander, SEAL Team 6. Ghost actual. Dalton's face changed. I was there, he said softly. I know. Her father had been declared killed in Fallujah in 2004. But Dalton knew the truth. Ryan Harmon had been betrayed, sold, traded for intelligence, and the man responsible was Colonel Alan Marsh. Why did the mission exist in the first place? The third level existed, just like Tessa suspected, and at the end of a narrow corridor they found him. Ryan Harmon, alive, 20 years older, but unmistakably the same man. When he saw Dalton, he smiled faintly. Took you long enough. Then he saw Tessa, his daughter. She sat beside him and took his wrist automatically, checking his pulse. Medical instinct. Vitals, she said quietly. He almost laughed. Later they learned the truth. Volkov hadn't been kidnapped. The entire mission had been staged. Marsh needed both Harmons in one place. Somewhere he controlled. Somewhere their deaths could look like a mission failure. But Marsh had made one mistake. He didn't know Tessa was already looking for the third level. When the contractors arrived, the team fought their way out. 11 brutal minutes in narrow corridors. Gunfire. Blood. Pain. Tessa fought and treated injuries at the same time. On a leg that had already broken completely. 9 hours. 9 hours she had walked on it. 9 hours she never mentioned it. Because the mission came first. When the helicopter finally lifted into the night sky, Kowalski sat beside her in silence. He had misjudged her. Badly. But she never said a word about it. Because dignity rarely needs to speak. It simply acts. And sometimes, the strongest person in the room isn't the loudest soldier. Sometimes it's the quiet medic walking on a broken leg, who never asked anyone to notice. Why was the medic studying the terrain like a sniper when no one had asked her to? Morning crept slowly over to Tbilisi, turning the rooftops pale gold while the streets below were still quiet and half asleep. The safe house sat at the edge of an old industrial district where rusted rail tracks cut through rows of silent warehouses. Nothing about the building suggested importance. Which was exactly the point. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil, coffee, and cold electronics. Maps covered the walls. Satellite imagery layered over hand-drawn notes. Laptops hummed quietly on folding tables. Rex Dalton stood near the largest map board, arms crossed. He had been studying this mission for 12 hours straight. But something about it still felt wrong. Facilities like this didn't appear overnight. Soviet mining tunnels ran for miles underground, carved through rock by generations of workers and soldiers. Intelligence claimed the facility had 2 operational sublevels. B1, B2. That was the official report. Dalton had learned long ago that official reports rarely told the whole story. The door opened behind him. He turned. Tessa Harmon stepped inside carrying a small black duffel bag. She moved quietly, not trying to be invisible, just naturally quiet, like someone who had learned to conserve motion the way others conserved energy. Dalton studied her for a second. Mid-30s. Lean. Calm eyes that moved constantly, collecting information without making a show of it. Not what Kowalski had been expecting when he requested a replacement medic. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Harmon, Dalton said. Yes, sir. Her voice was steady. No attempt to impress, no attempt to sound tougher than she was. Just direct. Across the room, Kowalski leaned back against a metal table. He watched her like someone inspecting a tool he wasn't sure he wanted to use. No offense, he said casually. His tone suggested the opposite. But when we asked for a replacement operator, we didn't mean a nurse. The room went quiet. Moments like this always revealed something about people. Some argued. Some tried to prove themselves. Some laughed it off. Tessa Harmon simply placed her duffel bag on the floor and began unpacking medical supplies. "No offense taken," she said. Her calmness irritated Kowalski more than an argument would have. Dalton noticed, but he said nothing, because missions didn't have time for ego. And if Tessa Harmon was bothered, she hid it well. Within minutes, she had laid out her equipment across a corner table. Field trauma kit, compression bandages, chest seals, IV supplies. Every item placed exactly where her hands would expect to find it in the dark. But then she did something strange. Instead of reviewing casualty protocols like most medics would, she walked to the wall map. Holt noticed first. Fletcher Holt had spent half his career behind a sniper scope. That kind of work sharpened a particular kind of awareness, the ability to notice small things others overlooked. He watched her trace a finger slowly along the ridgeline above the mining facility. Not the approach route. The high ground. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the contour lines. Dalton noticed too. "You see something?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned closer to the map. "The satellite imagery," she said finally, "shows a uniform slope on the north approach." "That's correct," Dalton said. "But the runoff patterns don't match that terrain." Now Kowalski looked up. "What does that mean?" he asked. Tessa pointed to a narrow cluster of faint lines near the ridge. "Water flows differently when it hits rock shelves," she explained quietly. "These patterns suggest a ledge here." She tapped the map. 200 meters from the entrance. Dalton stepped closer. "You're saying there's a natural shelf we didn't detect?" "I'm saying the water thinks there is." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Holt smiled slightly. Because that was exactly how a sniper thought. Terrain. Angles. Hidden shapes in the land. Dalton folded his arms. "You study geology in medical school?" he asked. "No, sir." "Then how did you notice that?" Tessa shrugged faintly. "I pay attention." It was such a simple answer that no one challenged it. But Holt filed it away. Because medics didn't usually read terrain like that. And something about Tessa Harmon felt layered. Like a story with missing chapters. Later that afternoon, the team gathered around the operations table. Satellite images of the mining complex glowed on a laptop screen. 2 confirmed levels. Primary access tunnel. Secondary maintenance shafts. Guard rotations. Thermal imaging. Everything looked clean. Too clean. Dalton rubbed his jaw slowly. "What's the extraction plan if the south route collapses?" he asked. Holt answered. "We move north to the secondary ridge line." Kowalski pointed to the map. "That's a steep climb." 30 degrees, Holt said. "Manageable." Tessa spoke quietly from the corner. 40. Everyone looked at her. "The incline is closer to 40 degrees, she added. "How do you know that?" Kowalski asked. She pointed to the elevation markings. "They're using older Soviet grid measurements. Western conversions round them down." Dalton blinked once, then looked at Holt. Holt checked the numbers again. She was right. He leaned back slowly. "You sure you're just a medic?" Tessa didn't answer that. Instead, she zipped her medical bag closed. Because the truth was complicated. And she wasn't here to explain herself. Not yet. Night arrived quickly in the Caucasus Mountains. By 2200 hours, the team was loading into the helicopter, waiting on a dark airstrip outside the city. The aircraft crouched low against the ground like a mechanical insect. An MH-6 little bird. Small, vast, designed for precision insertions. Rotor blades began spinning slowly, stirring dust across the concrete. The wind from the rotors flattened Tessa's hair against her forehead as she climbed aboard. Inside the cabin, the world turned green through night vision goggles. Engines roared. Then the helicopter lifted. Below them, the lights of Tbilisi shrank into glowing threads. Within minutes, the aircraft was skimming the dark ridges of the Caucasus Mountains. Cold air leaked through the cabin seams. No one spoke much. Before a mission, there was always a moment of quiet. Not fear exactly. More like the stillness before a storm. Tessa sat near the rear door, watching the terrain slide beneath them. Green ridges, black valleys, moving shadows. Then she leaned slightly toward Holt. "There's the shelf," she said quietly. He followed her gaze through the goggles. At first he saw nothing. Then there it was. A subtle break in the mountainside. Exactly where she predicted. Holt's eyebrows lifted. He leaned forward toward Dalton. "Northridge shelf confirmed," he murmured. Dalton glanced back at Tessa. She had already returned to silence. Just another medic sitting quietly in the helicopter. But something about that calm presence felt deliberate. Like someone who had been in places like this before. The helicopter dipped lower as the landing zone approached. Through the goggles, the ground looked empty. Just rock, frozen grass, shadows stretching across the mountainside. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. 30 seconds. Dalton checked his rifle. Kowalski rolled his shoulders. Holt adjusted the sniper case beside him. And Tessa Harmon quietly tightened the strap around her medical kit. Her heartbeat stayed steady. But somewhere deep in her chest, another feeling stirred. Not fear. Something older. Something personal. Because buried somewhere inside that mountain, there might be answers. Answers she had been chasing for 7 years. But there was something she hadn't told the team. Not yet. And if Dalton discovered the truth about why she volunteered for this mission, he might have left her behind. The helicopter descended toward the cold ground. Rotor wash blasted dust and loose stone into the air. The mountain swallowed the sound of the engines. Dalton stood. Moved. Boots hit the earth. One by one, the seals disappeared into the darkness. Tessa stepped out last. The ground beneath her boot shifted slightly as she landed. A small stone rolled under her heel. Her ankle twisted sharply. Inside the joint something snapped. A small sound. Barely audible. But she felt it instantly. The sharp, clean signal of a fracture beginning. Pain flared. Bright. Sudden. Her body wanted to collapse. But she shifted her weight forward. Took another step. And kept walking. Because missions didn't pause for injuries. And some secrets couldn't afford to slow down. What kind of soldier hears a bone crack and keeps walking like nothing happened? The mountain was silent. Not peaceful silent. The kind of silence that belonged to empty places, where people rarely survived long enough to leave memories behind. Boots moved carefully across frost-hardened grass as the team advanced toward the dark mouth of the abandoned mine. Above them, the jagged peaks of the Caucasus Mountains cut into the night sky like broken glass. Rex Dalton moved at the front, rifle steady, eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Holt followed slightly behind, the long case containing the sniper rifle slung across his back. Kowalski and Weld formed the center. Sloan stayed near the rear. And behind him, Tessa Harmon walked quietly. Her right boot pressed into the ground. Her left boot followed. Each step sent a sharp pulse of pain up through her ankle. She had heard the sound clearly when it happened. That faint internal snap. A stress fracture. Maybe worse. 7 years of medical training had taught her exactly what the sound meant. But she also knew something else. If she spoke now, the mission would slow. Someone would carry her gear. Someone would watch her. And attention was the one thing she couldn't afford. So she kept walking. Her breathing stayed slow and controlled. Her face stayed calm. Only the slight stiffness in her stride betrayed anything. Even that disappeared after the first 100 meters. Because pain, like fear, eventually becomes background noise if you refuse to listen to it. Ahead, Dalton raised a fist. The team froze instantly. He crouched near a rock ledge and studied the mine entrance through his night vision. 2 guards, one standing, one sitting on a crate smoking. Their rifles leaned casually against the wall beside them. Complacent. That was good. Dalton signaled quietly. 2 fingers halt. Then a small circular motion. Suppressors. Holt moved smoothly beside him and unpacked the rifle with the slow precision of someone who had done this thousands of times. The long barrel of the weapon pointed toward the entrance. Wind drifted lightly across the mountainside. 8 miles per hour. Left to right. Holt adjusted without thinking. 2 breaths. A pause between heartbeats. The rifle whispered. The standing guard dropped instantly. The second man looked up in confusion. The second suppressed shot followed before he could reach his weapon. Silence returned to the mountainside. Dalton nodded. Move. The team approached the mine entrance carefully. Up close, the structure looked older than intelligence had suggested. Rust streaked the steel support beams. The concrete around the entrance had cracked from decades of freeze and thaw. This place hadn't just been abandoned. It had been forgotten. Inside, the tunnel sloped downward into darkness. Cold air drifted outward, carrying the smell of metal, dust, and old machinery. Tessa stepped inside last. The temperature dropped immediately. Her breath fogged faintly in front of her goggles. Each step down the sloping tunnel sent another pulse of pain through her leg. But she ignored it. Instead, her eyes moved constantly. Walls, ceiling pipes, electrical conduits, anything that could hide danger. They reached the first interior junction within minutes. 3 corridors. Dalton studied the map inside his wrist display. Main shaft continues south, he whispered. Secondary corridor east, storage west. Kowalski pointed toward the south tunnel. Volkov should be on the 2nd level. Dalton nodded. South it is. They moved deeper. The mine was bigger than expected. Steel rails for ore carts still ran along parts of the floor. Old conveyor belts hung frozen in place like skeletons of machines that had stopped breathing decades ago. Their boots echoed faintly against the concrete. Every sound felt too loud, too exposed. Tessa's ankle throbbed harder now. The swelling had already begun inside her boot. She could feel the pressure building. But she said nothing. Because pain was temporary. Missions were not. The first sign of trouble came 10 minutes later. Weld raised his hand suddenly. Thermal movement ahead. Dalton crouched beside him and looked through the corner mirror. 2 guards approaching from the south corridor. Not casual like the ones outside. Alert. Weapons ready. Someone inside the facility knew something was wrong. Dalton signaled quickly. Ambush positions. The team spread into the shadows along the corridor walls. Tessa stayed near the rear with Sloan. Her pulse slowed automatically. Not fear. Focus. The guards came closer. Their voices echoed faintly in Russian. One of them laughed about something. The other complained about the cold. Normal conversation. Normal patrol. Until they stepped around the corner. Two suppressed shots. Two bodies hit the floor before their brains had time to understand what happened. Dalton dragged them quickly into a side room. Time just got shorter, Kowalski whispered. Dalton nodded. They know something's wrong. They moved faster now. Down another corridor. Then another staircase. Concrete steps spiraled downward into the earth. Level B1. The air smelled different here. More metallic. More industrial. Tessa noticed it immediately. Old ventilation systems. Oil. Electrical heat. Which meant something down here was still running. Machines didn't breathe unless someone kept them alive. Her eyes drifted briefly toward a sealed blast door at the end of a side hallway. The door looked newer than everything else around it. Fresh welding. Modern hinges. But Dalton's route continued the opposite direction. Toward the detention area. She said nothing. But the door stayed in her mind. Somewhere deeper in the facility, a heavy metal clang echoed faintly. Then footsteps. More patrols now. The team moved carefully through the maze of corridors until they reached a reinforced steel door with a small observation window. Dalton looked inside, then nodded. Target confirmed. Volkov. The Ukrainian scientist sat inside the cell looking exhausted but alive. His beard had grown thick over the last 11 days. Dark circles hung under his eyes. But when the door opened, he stood immediately. Relief flooded his face. "Thank God," he whispered. Sloane checked him quickly. "Dehydrated. Minor bruising. But stable." "We're leaving," Dalton told him. Volkov nodded quickly. But as he stepped into the hallway, his eyes landed on Tessa. Something changed in his expression. Not recognition exactly. Something deeper. Like a memory surfacing unexpectedly. "They were waiting," he said quietly. Dalton frowned. Who was waiting? Volkov hesitated. His gaze stayed on Tessa. For her. The corridor fell silent. Kowalski glanced at Dalton. "For who?" Dalton asked. But Volkov didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Tessa again. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if confirming something he didn't quite understand yet. And for the first time since the mission began, Tessa Harmon felt a small ripple of unease move through her chest. Because Volkov wasn't looking at her like a medic. He was looking at her like someone who already knew her story. Or worse, like someone who knew the part she hadn't told anyone. Dalton gestured forward. "Extraction point is North Ridge. Move." They started back through the corridors. But behind them, somewhere deeper in the mine, a heavy steel door slowly unlocked. And men who had been waiting for hours finally began to move. Why did the scientist stare at her like he already knew her, before anyone had spoken a single word? The corridor felt tighter on the way out. Maybe it was the tension. Maybe it was the knowledge that something inside this mission had just shifted. Volkov walked between Kowalski and Sloane, moving carefully but quickly. His breathing was uneven, the exhaustion of 11 days in captivity still weighing on him. Yet every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward Tessa. Not fear. Recognition. Dalton noticed it. Dalton noticed everything. "Eyes forward," he whispered sharply to the team. They moved through the narrow concrete passage, boots landing softly on the cold floor. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling like frozen snakes. Every few meters a flickering light buzzed weakly, throwing long shadows across the walls. Tessa walked near the rear again. Her injured ankle had grown worse. The swelling had spread inside the boot, tightening the leather around her foot. Every step sent a dull wave of pain upward through her leg. A fracture? Almost certainly. But fractures were manageable. Pain was information. And information was something she had learned to control. So she walked. Dalton slowed near the first stairwell, leading back to B1. He held up 2 fingers. Movement above. The team pressed against the walls. Bootsteps echoed faintly down the concrete stairs. 2 guards descending, talking quietly in Russian. Dalton glanced toward Holt. Holt nodded. 2 suppressed shots cracked softly through the corridor. The footsteps stopped instantly. 2 bodies slid down the stairs and landed in a heap at the bottom. Kowalski checked the landing. Clear. They climbed quickly. Halfway up the stairs, Volkov spoke quietly. "You should not have come." Dalton glanced back. "We come when Americans get taken," he replied. Volkov shook his head faintly. "You misunderstand." His voice dropped even lower. "This facility, it was not for me." That made Dalton pause. "What do you mean?" But Volkov hesitated again. His eyes drifted toward Tessa. Then away. "Later," he whispered. Dalton didn't like unanswered questions. But the mission came first. They continued climbing. At the top of the stairs, they re-entered the first sublevel corridor. The air here felt different now. Less still. Like something had disturbed the quiet. Holt noticed it too. "Listen," he murmured. Everyone froze. At first there was nothing. Then faintly, the distant echo of boots. More than 2. More than 3. Dalton's jaw tightened. "They know we're here." Kowalski peeked around the corner. 3 men moving quickly down the adjacent corridor. Weapons ready. Not the lazy guards from earlier. Professionals. Kowalski leaned back. Private security. Contractors, Holt added quietly. Dalton nodded. Which raised a bigger question. Why were contractors guarding an abandoned Soviet mine? The answer came faster than expected. Gunfire exploded suddenly down the hallway. Rounds slammed into the concrete corner where Kowalski had been standing seconds earlier. Dust sprayed into the air. Dalton pulled back. "Contact." The corridor erupted into chaos. Holt fired twice. 2 suppressed shots dropped the lead attacker. But the others scattered into cover. More gunfire echoed through the tunnels. Ricochets screamed off the metal pipes above. Tessa moved automatically. Her brain shifted instantly into medical mode. She grabbed Weld by the vest and pulled him behind a thick support column. "You hit." "Negative," he grunted. Sloan was already checking Kowalski. "Good." Dalton leaned around the corner and fired 3 controlled bursts. The contractors responded immediately. These weren't amateurs. They moved like soldiers. Because they were. Which meant someone had expected resistance. Volkov crouched low behind the team. His face had gone pale. "They are early," he whispered. Dalton turned sharply. "Early for what?" Volkov didn't answer. Another burst of gunfire slammed into the wall above them. Chunks of concrete fell like gravel. Holt shifted position and lined up another shot. A contractor leaned too far out from cover. The suppressed round hit him square in the chest. He dropped instantly. Silence followed. For 3 seconds. Then footsteps. More of them. Dalton swore quietly. They're coming from both sides, which meant the team was about to be pinned. The corridor layout suddenly mattered. 3 entrances, 1 exit. Bad odds. Tessa's mind moved quickly. She looked down the side hallway to her left. Dark, narrow, but it curved slightly out of sight. "Dalton," she whispered. He glanced at her. "Secondary corridor left," she said. "Leads back to the main shaft." Dalton frowned. "That route wasn't on the map." "I know." Another burst of gunfire ripped through the corridor. Dalton didn't have time to debate. "Move." The team shifted instantly. Kowalski and Holt covered the rear, while Dalton pushed Volkov down the side hallway. Tessa followed last. Her ankle screamed as she pivoted sharply into the corridor. But adrenaline pushed the pain aside. For now, they moved quickly through the dark passage. Their headlamps cut thin beams through the dust. The hallway curved exactly the way Tessa predicted. After 20 meters, it opened into a wider tunnel. An old ore transport line. Dalton looked back at her. "How did you know this was here?" Tessa shrugged lightly. Older minds follow predictable patterns. That answer satisfied no one. But the gunfire behind them was getting louder again, which meant the contractors had found the alternate route too. They ran. The tunnel sloped upward toward the surface levels. Volkov stumbled slightly. Sloane caught him before he fell. "Easy." Dalton checked his watch. Extraction window approaching fast. But something still bothered him. The contractors. The timing. The way Volkov had looked at Tessa. None of it fit. They reached another junction. 3 tunnels again. Dalton studied the map. Confusion crossed his face. This doesn't match the layout. Which meant the facility was bigger than intelligence had reported. Much bigger. Tessa looked down the far tunnel. The concrete there looked newer. Reinforced. Modern lighting. A sealed blast door stood at the end. Her stomach tightened slightly, because she had seen that door earlier. And something about it had felt wrong. Dalton noticed her staring. "What is it?" Tessa hesitated. Just for a moment. "Nothing," she said quietly. But before Dalton could ask more, Volkov spoke again. His voice shaking. "That level should not exist." Everyone turned toward him. "What level?" Kowalski asked. Volkov pointed toward the sealed blast door. "There." His voice dropped even lower. "That is not part of the mine." Dalton's expression hardened. "Then what is it part of?" Volkov swallowed slowly. "A prison." The words settled into the corridor like dust. Dalton stared at the door again. A prison. Hidden inside an abandoned mine. Guarded by contractors. Which meant someone powerful wanted something inside that level kept secret. And suddenly, Dalton understood something else. This mission had never been simple. Volkov had been bait. But the real question was, who or what was the trap meant to catch? Behind them, the sound of boots grew louder. The contractors were closing in again. Dalton checked the remaining corridors, then looked back at the blast door. His instincts screamed that opening it would complicate everything. But leaving without knowing what was inside felt worse. He turned to the team. 2 minutes. Kowalski frowned. For what? Dalton nodded toward the door. To find out why this place exists. But he didn't notice something else. Tessa Harmon had gone completely still. Her eyes fixed on the blast door. Not with curiosity. Not with fear. But with the quiet, controlled tension of someone who had just found the exact place she had been searching for. For 7 years. Why did her hands tremble the moment the blast door began to open? The corridor had gone strangely quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of safety, but the tense silence that appears right before something breaks. Rex Dalton stood in front of the reinforced blast door, studying the locking mechanism with a small tactical light. The steel surface reflected the beam in dull scratches and worn metal scars. Whoever built this door had intended it to last. And to keep something inside. Behind him, Kowalski and Holt covered the corridor they had come from. Their rifles pointed toward the distant bend in the tunnel where the contractors would eventually appear again. They all knew it. It was only a matter of time. Sloan stood beside Volkov, checking his pulse again. The scientist looked pale, his breathing shallow, eyes darting nervously between the soldiers and the sealed door. But Tessa Harmon wasn't looking at any of them. She was staring at the door, completely still. Her breathing had changed. Not faster, deeper, like someone preparing themselves for something they had imagined many times before. Dalton ran a hand over the control panel mounted beside the door. Old Soviet construction, modified with newer electronics. Someone had retrofitted this section of the mine in the last decade. He glanced back. "You recognize this?" he asked Volkov. Volkov shook his head slowly. "I was never brought here." "But you knew about it." Volkov hesitated. "Yes." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "What's inside?" The scientist swallowed. "Someone important." That answer hung in the air like fog. Kowalski looked over his shoulder. "Important enough to build a secret prison under a mountain." Volkov didn't answer. Dalton turned toward Holt. "Charges?" Holt nodded and stepped forward with a small breaching kit. He worked quickly, attaching a shaped charge along the locking seam. Precise, quiet, professional. The kind of work that turned sealed doors into open pathways. Tessa watched him silently. Her fingers curled slightly into her palm. The pain in her ankle had become a constant burn now, but she barely noticed it. Because every second brought her closer to something she had spent years chasing. 7 years. 7 years of questions. 7 years of dead ends. 7 years of whispers that ended in silence. And now, the answer was standing 10 feet in front of her. Holt stepped back. "Ready." Dalton nodded. "Everyone clear." They moved away from the door. Volkov pressed himself against the wall. Sloan pulled him down beside him. Tessa didn't move at first. Dalton noticed. "Harmon." She blinked, then stepped back. Holt triggered the detonator. The charge popped sharply, a quick, controlled blast that echoed through the tunnel like a hammer striking steel. Dust drifted through the air. The heavy locking mechanism snapped apart. Dalton stepped forward and gripped the edge of the door. It resisted at first. Then slowly it groaned open. The sound rolled through the corridor like thunder. Inside was darkness, but not the dusty emptiness of an abandoned mine. This space was different. Clean. Modern. White lights flickered on automatically as the door opened wider. A long hallway stretched ahead, lined with reinforced glass cells. Not prison bars. Observation chambers. Dalton stepped inside first. His boots echoed across a polished concrete floor. The air smelled sterile. Filtered. Alive. Which meant power was running down here. Someone was maintaining this level. Kowalski followed. Jesus. The cells were empty. Every single one. Except the final chamber at the end of the hall. A single man sat inside. Older, gray beard, lean frame, but his posture remained straight. Alert, he looked up slowly as the team approached. His eyes landed on Dalton first. Recognition flashed across his face. "Well," the man said calmly. "Took you long enough." Dalton stopped walking. For a second he simply stared. Then his expression changed. Shock. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a deep stillness spreading across his face. "Ryan," Dalton whispered. The name echoed faintly through the sterile hallway. Behind him, Kowalski frowned. "You know this guy?" Dalton didn't answer. Because the man in the cell was someone the world believed had been dead for 20 years. A former operator. A ghost. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Harmon. And suddenly, every piece of the puzzle began sliding into place. Volkov's strange warning. The hidden prison. The contractors. The entire mission. Dalton slowly turned his head. His eyes moved toward Tessa. She had stopped several steps behind them. Her face looked calm. But her eyes had changed. Ryan Harmon noticed her at the same moment. His breath caught. For the first time since the team arrived, his composure cracked. "Tessa." The name sounded almost fragile in his voice. Kowalski blinked. "What?" Dalton exhaled slowly. The truth settled heavily in the room. He looked at Tessa again. "You knew," he said quietly. She didn't deny it. She stepped forward slowly, each step sending lightning through her broken leg. But she didn't stop. 7 years of searching had brought her here. To this moment. She reached the glass cell. Ryan Harmon stood slowly inside it. His eyes studied her face like someone reading a memory that had been locked away for decades. "You look like your mother," he said softly. Tessa's throat tightened. For a moment she couldn't speak. All the training, all the control, all the quiet strength she had carried through the mission. Suddenly it felt fragile. But she steadied herself. Because there was still one question that mattered. Only one. "Why?" she asked. Ryan's smile faded. He glanced briefly at Dalton, then back at his daughter. "Because someone sold me," he said quietly. The corridor went silent again. Kowalski shifted uneasily. "Sold you to who?" Ryan's answer came slowly. "To the man who built this prison." Dalton felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Because suddenly he already knew the answer. But he needed to hear it. Ryan looked directly at him. Then spoke the name. Colonel Alan Marsh. Volkov closed his eyes. Kowalski cursed under his breath. And Dalton felt something colder than the mountain air move through him. Because Colonel Marsh wasn't just some distant intelligence officer. Marsh had authorized this entire mission. Which meant something else. Something far worse. They had never been sent here to rescue Volkov. They had been sent here to die. And somewhere far above the mountain, a man in a quiet office was probably waiting for the radio to go silent. Waiting for confirmation that the last 2 Harmons had disappeared forever. But what Marsh didn't know yet was that his trap had just failed. And the people inside this mountain were no longer his prisoners. They were survivors. And survivors rarely stay quiet for long. Why did the entire mission suddenly feel like it had never been meant to succeed? For a moment, no one spoke. The sterile hallway beneath the mountain felt colder than the frozen slopes above. The reinforced glass cell stood open now, its locking mechanism torn apart by Holt's charge. Ryan Harmon stepped out slowly, his movements stiff after years of confinement. 20 years. 2 decades inside a hidden prison carved beneath the Caucasus Mountains. Yet his posture still carried the quiet discipline of a man who had once served with United States Navy SEALs. Rex Dalton watched him carefully. The past had just walked into the room, and the past had a way of breaking open old wounds. "Took you long enough," Ryan repeated softly. Dalton exhaled. "You were declared KIA in Fallujah." Ryan gave a faint, humorless smile. "Someone made sure of that." Behind them, Kowalski checked the hallway nervously. "We've got a bigger problem," he muttered. Footsteps. Not distant anymore. The contractors were getting closer. Dalton turned toward Holt. "How long?" "2 minutes, maybe less." "Not enough time." "Not nearly enough." Dalton looked back at Ryan. "Can you move?" Ryan nodded once. "I've been waiting 20 years to leave this place." Then his eyes shifted to Tessa. She stood a few steps away from him, shoulders squared, trying to hold together emotions that had waited her entire life for this moment. Her father studied her face carefully. Not like a soldier. Like a parent memorizing a child he never thought he would see again. "You became a medic," he said quietly. Tessa swallowed. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Good choice." For a second, neither of them moved. There were too many things to say. Too many years between them. But this wasn't the place for reunions. The mission still wasn't finished. And somewhere above them, a man named Alan Marsh was expecting them to fail. Dalton stepped forward. "We need to move now." Ryan nodded. But as he stepped beside Tessa, his eyes dropped briefly toward her stance. Toward the subtle imbalance in the way she stood. A SEAL's eyes missed very little. "Your leg," he said quietly. She shook her head immediately. "I'm fine." But Sloane had already noticed the swelling pushing against her boot. He crouched quickly. "Harmon, how long?" She didn't answer. He pressed 2 fingers along her ankle. Tessa sucked in a quiet breath despite herself. Sloane looked up slowly. "This isn't new." Dalton frowned. "What are we talking about?" Sloane's voice stayed calm. "She's been walking on a fracture." Kowalski stared. "For how long?" Sloane glanced at her. Tessa answered quietly. "Since the landing zone." The hallway went silent again. That had been nearly 6 hours ago. Dalton blinked. "You walked 6 hours on a broken ankle." "Stress fracture at first," Sloane said. "Probably worse now." Ryan looked at his daughter with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't pride either. "Something complicated." "You should have said something." She met his gaze calmly. "The mission came first." Dalton studied her for a long second. Then nodded once. Not approval. Just acknowledgement. Because every operator in that hallway understood the decision she had made. But there was no more time for discussion. Gunfire suddenly cracked down the corridor behind them. Rounds struck the far wall of the prison hallway, sending glass fragments spraying across the floor. "Contact!" Kowalski shouted. The contractors had arrived. 4 of them rushed into the corridor entrance, rifles raised. Holt dropped to one knee instantly. 2 suppressed shots. 2 enemies fell. But the others scattered into cover. Gunfire erupted. The quiet prison level exploded into noise. Dalton grabbed Volkov and shoved him behind a support pillar. Sloane dragged Tessa down beside him. "Stay low." Ryan picked up one of the fallen contractor's rifles. His hands moved across the weapon like muscle memory, returning after a long sleep. 20 years hadn't erased his training. The firefight lasted 11 brutal minutes. Tight hallways. Short angles, controlled bursts. Concrete chipped and cracked under the storm of bullets. The contractors were good, but the SEALs were better. One by one, the attackers fell back down the corridor. Then silence returned again, broken only by the ringing in everyone's ears. Dalton checked the hallway. Clear. For now. He looked at Holt. Extraction route. Holt pulled up the map display. North Ridge. Dalton nodded. Move. They began climbing back through the mine tunnels toward the surface. The journey out felt longer than the way in. Every step hurt. Every breath burned. Tessa's ankle had fully given way an hour earlier. The fracture had spread. But she kept walking. Ryan noticed. Everyone noticed. But no one said anything. Because sometimes strength didn't look dramatic. Sometimes it looked quiet. Like a medic walking through the dark, without asking anyone to slow down. When they finally reached the mine entrance, the cold night air hit their faces like freedom. The helicopter was already approaching. The familiar silhouette of an MH-6 little bird cut through the sky above the mountain. Rotor blades thundered across the ridge. Dalton signaled with a strobe light. The aircraft descended quickly. Dust and frozen grass exploded around them in the rotor wash. Everyone climbed aboard fast. Ryan helped Tessa into the cabin. The moment the door shut, the helicopter lifted away from the mountain. Below them, the dark slopes of the Caucasus Mountains disappeared into shadow. Inside the aircraft, nobody spoke for several minutes. The adrenaline slowly faded. Exhaustion replaced it. Finally, Kowalski leaned back against the cabin wall and looked at Tessa. "I owe you an apology," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For thinking you were just a medic." Tessa gave a faint smile. "I am just a medic." Kowalski shook his head. "Not after tonight." Across the cabin, Ryan watched his daughter quietly. He had missed 20 years of her life. 20 years he could never get back. But he had seen something tonight that told him everything he needed to know. She had grown strong. Stronger than he ever expected. Dalton looked out the helicopter window toward the dark horizon. Somewhere far away, Colonel Marsh would soon learn the truth. The mission hadn't erased the Harmons. It had brought them back. And secrets buried for decades rarely stay buried forever. But that reckoning would come later. For now, the mountain faded into darkness beneath them. And in the quiet hum of the helicopter cabin, one simple truth settled gently over the team. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it doesn't shout or demand recognition. Sometimes it simply walks forward, even on a broken leg. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply acts.